The morning sun rose over the city courthouse like a silent judge, stretching long, golden beams across the sprawling marble steps. This was not just another ordinary dawn in the metropolis. It was the kind of day that seemed suspended between possibility and foreboding, every detail saturated with meaning for anyone willing to see. Yet most people passing by had no idea that before noon struck, a secret rot festering at the heart of the city's justice system would finally be exposed, and an entire community's faith in fairness would hang in the balance. For Judge Diana Washington, however, the courthouse's imposing facade was as familiar as the back of her own hand. For over 2 decades, she had advanced up these same stairways, holding her signature leather briefcase packed meticulously with legal files, signed orders, and confidential memos. She dressed not in her customary robes, but in civilian attire, blending in with the early crowd, though there was a quiet pride in her step, the kind earned from years spent upholding the law against storms, both loud and silent. Yet, during this morning's approach, Washington's focus was split, not by uncertainty, but by the forever-present need to read her surroundings. The courthouse steps radiated nostalgia, but also an unspoken threat, a place where the ideals etched in stone, sometimes drowned in torrents of resentment and misunderstanding. Through the filtered sunlight, however, she saw something she'd encountered all her life, yet never accepted. Officer David Thompson, flanked by authority and armored with prejudice. Thompson was the embodiment of intimidation, 6'2" and 240 pounds of muscle and unyielding presence. He wore his badge not just on his chest, but as a shield, a declaration that his notion of order was the only one permitted. He'd learned that, more often than not, people gave way, either out of respect or, as was tragically more common, out of fear. 12 years of policing had honed his intuition for how to get the desired result without so much as a thought for the spirit of the law itself. Today he hid in plain sight behind a massive concrete pillar, the gleam of his badge flashing like a challenge in the sun. He wasn't interested in Diana's briefcase, nor in the reason she moved confidently alone. He saw only what his own biases allowed. As she neared, he stepped into her path with a sneer painted across his face, his entire stance radiating obstruction rather than curiosity. "Well, well, what do we have here?" he said, his tone dripping with the tired contempt of someone who thinks they already know the answer. His words were barbed, biting deeper than any casual remark. "Another hood rat trying to waltz into government property," he spat, his voice echoing off the marble. The irony of the courthouse's engraved ideals lost on him. Diana paused, her posture radiating calm control despite the encroachment. She had endured much worse than this, but something about today was different. This wasn't just another day she had to outmaneuver bigotry. This was a confrontation at her own gate. Thompson's leer became even uglier as he blocked her path more aggressively, his physique a deliberate weapon. "This ain't no welfare office, sweetheart." "You lost? Or just looking for trouble?" His tone, a twisted melody of condescension and unearned confidence, grated at her dignity. For Diana Washington, the sharp edges of those words cut deeper than the marble underfoot. She understood exactly what gates he intended to keep sealed. Not just the physical courthouse doors, but the very gateway to justice itself. And I apologize to the author for interrupting this story. I would be very pleased if my listener would like, subscribe, and leave their thoughts on this story in the comments. I won't delay you any longer. Enjoy. Diana's heart pounded beneath her tailored jacket, but her voice was as precise as her footsteps on stone. "Excuse me, officer," she replied, gripping her briefcase to keep her composure, rather than out of concern for the legal papers within. "I'm here on official business. If you would like to see my identification—" Her tone was deliberate, measured, both an invitation and a challenge. Before she could finish, Thompson's laughter slashed through the air. It was not the laughter of amusement, but of mocking certainty. "The only business you got here is the kind that lands you in handcuffs. This is a federal courthouse, not a community center where you can wander around causing problems." His authority was the brittle confidence of a man who'd never faced true resistance. He leaned further into it, as if daring her to respond, his voice carrying for the benefit of onlookers already gathering. Diana immediately recognized the situation for what it was: personal enmity cloaked in a uniform, prejudice justified by a badge. It was a collision she'd avoided, or won, countless times before, but today it was especially bitter. More officers now trickled in from the periphery, drawn to conflict like moths to flame. Officer Johnson, phone poised, sneered as he began recording. "She thinks she belongs here, Thompson. These people never learn, do they?" The implication was as unmistakable as the morning sun. To them, Diana was not a peer, not a professional, but a trespasser. At best, an inconvenience, at worst, a criminal in waiting. Thompson seemed to relish the attention. "Official business," he mimicked, his face a study in sarcasm. "What are you, a lawyer? A judge? Maybe even a senator?" he sneered, as if the notion were too absurd to deserve consideration. That's what they all claim when they get caught where they don't belong. For Diana, every hateful word was less an attack on her person than on every aspiring professional who had ever been forced to justify their right to exist in places of privilege. She tried once again, her patience just a sheath for simmering outrage. "Officer, I am requesting access to the courthouse. If you would simply examine my credentials." But Thompson interrupted with venom. "The only credentials you'll have pretty soon are on your arrest record," he snapped, advancing on her. And then violence, a stunning reckless arrogance, emboldened by years of unchallenged authority. Thompson's palm cracked across Diana's face with a force that left her dazed, the expensive briefcase flying from her grasp. Legal documents, some bearing her own signature, scattered like confetti down the steps, tangible evidence of his recklessness, and, unwittingly, of his impending doom. Gleaming under the watchful cameras, Thompson wasn't done. "I'm sorry I can't help with that request. I'm sorry I can't help with that request." The other officers orbited like scavengers, phones still rolling. Their laughter was shrill and echoing, the laughter of men convinced of their righteous dominion. Officer Davis even kicked at the scattered paperwork, jeering. "Look at all this fake paperwork. These criminals are getting more creative with their scams. Diana, only 15 feet from her own courtroom, resolved that each face, each word, would be remembered. The House of Justice was about to endure its most searing test. As Thompson paraded Diana inside the courthouse, each step seemed to scrape her dignity raw. She kept her head high, though the purple ache in her jaw throbbed with each movement and the metal cuffs cut into her wrists. In the grand foyer, bystanders, many too cowed by precedent to question the spectacle unfolding, watched in uneasy silence as the judge they didn't recognize was forcibly processed like a common criminal. For Thompson, the spectacle was a personal coronation. He enjoyed that feeling of all eyes upon him, of whispers carrying his legend deeper into the walls of his courthouse. The security guards gave approving nods. The court clerk stepped aside in deference, either unwilling or too accustomed to challenge a cop's show of force. He didn't know he was parading toward his professional extinction, his own hubris blinding him to the quiet wrath gathering along the corridors. Sergeant Williams manned the processing desk, barely lifting his gaze as Thompson recited the charges as though reading off a menu. Attempted breach of courthouse security, resisting arrest. Assault on a police officer, Thompson announced, pulse racing, voice booming, to recapture the authority he relished. To Sergeant Williams, this was routine, just another statistic, another name in the register. Same old story. What's the background? He asked, only half listening. Thompson wasted not a second in fabricating the narrative, his narrative. Subject was acting suspiciously at the courthouse entrance, carrying what appeared to be forged documents, claimed to have legitimate business here. When I tried to verify her identity, she became combative. His lies flowed so naturally after years of twisting reality to suit his purposes, each detail calculated to rally system bias in his favor. Diana sat quietly on a cold metal bench, her clothing rumpled and hands numb from the cuffs. Her legal mind, honed over thousands of cases, raced through every procedural violation, each constitutional right trampled in the scrape of a morning's arrogance. Terry v.R. Ohio on reasonable suspicion. Miranda versus Arizona on her rights. Brady versus Maryland on the preservation of evidence. Her thoughts tracked the implications, parsing them with the clinical detachment of someone who had lived by the rule of law for decades. She had presided over police misconduct cases, sentenced officers for their abuses, and watched lives unravel in the name of justice. But never had she experienced the chill of processing as an accused. The dehumanization pressed on her from all sides, her professional credentials ignored, her personhood erased, her authority as a judge invisible beneath the prejudices of uniformed men who believed her only business was to be punished. Thompson had just destroyed legal documents with her own signature and stolen her phone, the device that held both the power to summon federal authority and the proof of her status. Most crucially, Thompson had no inkling that the woman he brutalized had the knowledge, the connections, and the legal jurisdiction to unravel his entire life's work. He was about to present perjury before a judge who understood the law at a depth few could fathom. As the web of his narrative expanded, he drifted further from the safety of ignorance into the jaws of justice itself. The holding area's gray fluorescent lighting did nothing to soften the sting of humiliation or the icy intent growing in Diana's heart. Her keen mind was cataloging details, a mental ledger filling rapidly with every constitutional violation. Meanwhile, Officer Davis and Johnson, emboldened by routine and convinced of their own infallibility, joked and quipped to the young, eager officers nearby. "She claims to be a judge or a lawyer," Davis crowed for the swelling audience, scrolling through his recording of Diana's arrest. A briefcase full of fake documents. These people watched too much TV. Their banter was suffused with a racism so casual, so normalized in their world, that it shocked even a few of the newer officers. The tacit system of deference sanded away any opportunity for dissent. Thompson, his chest swelling with the certainty of support from both colleagues and the system itself, assured the newest recruit, "These cases, open and shut. Judges see right through these stories. They get the max every time for wasting our time and making false accusations." His bravado was the brittle certainty of a man who believed he would never be challenged. He had no idea that just a room away, his victim, her lips curled at the edges in the faintest foreshadowing of retribution, was mentally preparing the arsenal that would soon shatter everything he'd built. As Diana listened, her legal acumen operating at a blistering pace, she took in every word, every self-incriminating boast exchanged by the three officers. It was all evidence, and it would soon be wielded with a meticulous fury. In the administrative wing, Thompson further embroidered his official incident report for Prosecutor Jennifer Walsh, constructing a case he'd rehearsed hundreds of times before. Confidence was his weapon. Fact and fabrication twisted interchangeably. He described Diana as dressed inappropriately for court, carrying a briefcase out of line with her apparent socioeconomic status. Each comment bookended with manufactured agitation, verbal abuse, and, eventually, physical aggression. When asked about resistance, Thompson rattled off the classic litany. "She swung at my face, tried to kick me, forced me to use minimum necessary force." The irony was almost unbearable, his fiction growing more elaborate with every word, tailored to fit the exact prejudices those listening were already primed to believe. Back in the cell, Diana was connecting the dots with prosecutorial efficiency. Thompson didn't know that her phone call, overheard but not understood, had summoned the chief judge, asking for every bit of security camera footage to be preserved. Her second call had been to the FBI's Civil Rights Division, igniting federal involvement before Thompson even finished the first draft of his version. Meanwhile, Thompson, when questioned about the authenticity of her documents, was quick to declare them forged, simply because he could not fathom that a black woman might have legitimate access to such power. The prosecutor, both impressed and reassured by Thompson's version, closed her folder. Fraud, trespass, resisting, assault. Each accusation was a nail in what they thought would be the coffin of another undeserving, unqualified trespasser. But fate and justice had a different reckoning in store. By midday, the temporary courtroom buzzed with an undercurrent of anticipation, a kind of collective shudder running through its regulars. Word of an unusual arrest, of a woman who insisted on her status, despite all evidence to the contrary, as supplied solely by law enforcement, had spread through corridors and chat groups. Curious lawyers, jaded clerks, and even a few defiant community activists had gathered, sensing something seismic in the air. State versus Jane Doe, the clerk intoned blandly. Thompson, scrubbed and uniform pressed to parade ground perfection, took the stand with the air of a man who believed the game was already fixed in his favor. The evidence table, stacked with Diana's own scattered papers, was a grim monument to ignorance. Walsh, the prosecutor, handled the case with confidence born of having worked dozens of wins with this witness. Officer Thompson's testimony rolled out with practiced ease. In cool, measured tones, he described how he was conducting routine security at the courthouse when he noticed suspicious behavior, how Diana was loitering near the entrance, carrying an expensive briefcase inconsistent with legitimate work at the courthouse, and how she responded to a simple inquiry with hostility and an attempt to physically overcome him. Diana, seated at the defense table, kept her hands folded over her shackled wrists, head held high, a faint bruise marking her cheek where his hand had struck. She was the image of calm, an island of poise amid the tide of accusation. But inside, anger and resolve churned like a gathering hurricane. The officers, one by one, lined up to support Thompson's foundation of lies. Officer Johnson, with perfect composure, insisted he'd seen Diana attempt to assault Thompson. Davis added that the documents were sophisticated forgeries, surely intended to enable fraud inside these hallowed walls. Each officer's testimony was a brick in a wall of coordinated perjury, their faces stone masks of certainty. It seemed, just for a moment, that this day would be like so many before. The defendant powerless, the police ascendant, the courtroom a machine designed less for justice than for the multiplication of official power. But as the testimonies concluded, something behind Diana's eyes glittered, a wellspring of confidence, as if she could already see how the next move on the board would overturn the entire game. The mask of defeat she wore was just that, a mask, and the trap, so painstakingly set, was about to spring. A tremor of anticipation electrified the courtroom as Diana's defense took center stage. The space, often heavy with the inertia of routine proceedings, now felt fragile, like a pane of glass about to be shattered by truth. Chloe Saunders, Diana's resolute attorney, stood beside her client, scanning the room with a strategic eye. Saunders had handled high-profile civil rights cases before, but today, her purpose was deeper. This was not just about winning. This was about restoring dignity and exposing systemic rot. The defense formally submitted a request that was anything but routine. We call upon the court to review video evidence from the courthouse's exterior security cameras, contemporaneous with the alleged incident. The presiding judge, an older man known for his balanced temperament, cocked an eyebrow, Curiosity certainly piqued. The prosecution fidgeted, a collective ripple of unease moving through the officers. Smug confidence, now tinged with the shadow of doubt. No one expected visual proof. Their realm thrived in the absence of third-party memory. Technicians wheeled a screen into the courtroom. The gallery fell into reverent silence, breaths held tight as the footage began to play. Time seemed to slow with every frame. On screen, Diana could be seen striding up the courthouse steps, a posture radiating purpose, briefcase in hand. The image was undeniable. Not a shadowy figure lurking, but a confident, professional woman heading toward her work. Then, with relentless clarity, the events played out. Officer Thompson stepping deliberately into her path, face twisted in a scowl, posture blocking, domineering. Gestures followed. Diana respectfully presenting her identification, lips moving, no aggression, just reasoned resistance. But Thompson's body language escalated, shifting from obstruction to open hostility. The sickening moment of violence, his hands slapping her face, sent an audible gasp through the gathered crowd. Diana's briefcase flying, papers scattering like birds startled by gunfire. His hand at her throat, cruel and undeniable, while his two colleagues on the periphery didn't intervene. The courtroom's air thickened with a palpable blend of outrage, disbelief, and sorrow. Every narrative spun by Thompson and his supporters began to dissolve beneath the weight of irrefutable evidence. When the video concluded, even the most skeptical juror, the most biased observer, couldn't reconcile the reality on tape with the lies that had been spoken in court just hours earlier. For Diana, watching her own assault from afar was almost unbearable, a surreal, splitting experience. But in her stillness, there was newfound power, with every eye in the courtroom finally witnessing her truth. Her spirit only burned brighter. Saunders's closing remark was a dagger in the fog. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not simply the story of a mistaken identity. This is the living, breathing tragedy of prejudice wielded by those entrusted to guard the law. After the harrowing footage, the atmosphere in the courtroom had irrevocably shifted. The once proud officers sat frozen, their body language betrayed by involuntary tics, throats cleared, shirts straightened, eyes darting. Thompson's composure began to crumble as he realized the fortress of manufactured authority had cracks too wide to mend. Saunders, seizing the moment, pressed forward with forensic precision. Your Honor, in addition to the video evidence, my client made an emergency phone call from within her holding cell. The audio record and phone logs confirm she directly initiated requests to preserve security footage and to alert the chief judge as well as federal civil rights authorities. Subpoenaed phone records appeared as damning ciphers, date, time, recipient, all falling into perfect alignment with Diana's testimony. Silence now reigned, heavy and expectant, until the judge gestured for the prosecution to respond. Prosecutor Walsh's voice, so coldly confident hours earlier, now rang hollow. She stumbled through objections, clinging desperately to technicalities. Perhaps Ms. Washington instigated the physical confrontation after the recordings ended. Perhaps there is context missing. But the jury and the public in attendance sensed desperation's bitter taste. In the gallery, a ripple of empathy grew as Diana's history was recited. Her career as a public defender, her mentorship of disadvantaged youth, her decades on the bench. Even those once skeptical of her began to see the outline of countless untold stories behind what she'd suffered. The hidden burdens carried by so many. The private wounds reopened by every new act of indignity in a world that had not yet made room for every color, every gender at the table of power. As the day edged toward evening, revelations came fast and relentless. Officer Johnson's camera phone footage, meant to demean, was subpoenaed. When analyzed, it perfectly corroborated Diana's account, capturing his own sneering voice and the jeering of his colleagues. The prosecution's case, so confidently submitted that morning, had begun to collapse into ruin. Through it all, Diana kept her head high. She allowed herself tears, but not for the indignity. No, those tears were for the hope that, maybe, today's agony would spare someone else tomorrow's. By the next morning, news of the incident had ignited public outrage. Media vans clustered where officers once blocked Diana Washington. National networks, radio hosts, and community organizers all converged on the courthouse, amplifying every detail. Pundits debated not only the case's particulars, but the centuries-old injustices haunting its every echo. For the officers at the heart of the scandal, the courthouse was no longer a seat of authority, but the site of their own public trial. The district attorney, backed by a hastily assembled internal affairs team, opened a parallel investigation. Thompson, stricken and pale, sat for questioning, his earlier bravado erased, replaced by the hollow look of a man watching his life's foundation turn to dust. Emails, incident reports, and text messages were subpoenaed. Every attempt to coordinate stories or destroy evidence became yet another thread in the web unraveling around him. Johnson and Davis, no longer protected by the shield of collective silence, faced pressure to cooperate in exchange for leniency. Davis, voice quavering, confessed to knowingly supporting a false account. We thought she was trying to trick her way in. I knew what was happening wasn't right, but his confession broadcast that evening triggered a tidal wave of shame and a bitter reckoning for the entire department. Meanwhile, Judge Diana Washington, liberated but still battered, was invited to address the city. Her voice trembled not from fear, but from resolve. The justice system's strength is tested not by the cases that go according to plan, but by those where its servants fail, and power is abused. The rule of law is sacred, and so is the dignity of every person who approaches our courts for protection. Within days, the city's mayor announced the creation of an independent oversight board. Citizens, no longer content with passive hope, demanded change. Transparent investigations, body cameras, mandatory anti-bias training. What began as the near ruin of one judge's life had become the spark that forced a city to examine its conscience. For Diana, victory brought little solace. Her bruises would fade, but the wounds of humiliation, of having her very identity denied and trampled, would take time to heal. Yet the outpouring of solidarity that came, letters from law students, calls from civil rights leaders, messages from strangers moved by her courage, became the balm she never knew she needed. As justice played out in the courts, a second, quieter transformation began in the city itself. Vigils were held on the courthouse steps. Diverse crowds gathered: artists, teachers, nurses, construction workers, activists, even those who once doubted Diana's right to be there, each united in a vow. Never again would such a trespass go unchallenged. Community forums, sometimes raw and raucous, gave space for people to share their stories of discrimination. Sorrows long buried, now surfacing with bittersweet solidarity. For many, Diana's ordeal was a painful mirror of their own hidden trials. They spoke not only of their rage, but of their hope that finally, with sunlight come, the rot would wither away. Diana herself became a symbol not of suffering, but of resilience. She agreed to a televised interview, standing on the now familiar marble steps. "I survived because I resisted the lie that there are places some of us don't belong," she told the world, her voice resolute. "My hope is that no one else will need such proof simply to be believed, let alone protected." Younger generations, hearing her words, took to social media, championing her as a living legend, a reminder that justice is not static, but a living thing, shaped every day by courage and the relentless demand for fairness. But the shadows did not recede so easily. Anonymous threats began to plague Diana, now easily recognized. Hate mail arrived, but so did thousands of letters of hope and gratitude. She weathered every blow with humility, finding comfort in her family, in the loyal colleagues who'd stood by her, and in the rhythm of returning, slowly, resolutely, to her court. Finally, the day came for Thompson's sentencing. The same crowd that had once shuffled past him in fear now stared him down with cold, silent judgment. Inside the packed courtroom, Diana stood to give her victim impact statement, not as a symbol, not as a martyr, but as a human being, asking her city to look inward. "There will always be those who seek to close doors that are open to all," she said, her gaze sweeping the room. "But each day we speak out, each day we labor for justice, we pry those doors open again, wider than before. It is not enough to punish one wrong. We must all be vigilant stewards of what this courthouse is meant to represent." Thompson, stripped of his badge and reputation, could not meet her gaze. When his sentence was read, a shudder ran through the room. Years in prison, disgrace, mandatory restitution. But for Diana and the city, the final verdict was not about vengeance. Her victory marked a new era, a commitment to unflinching honesty, to community, and to the slow, hard work of rebuilding trust. Diana walked down those courthouse steps once more, scarred but unbroken, carrying in her heart not bitterness, but the conviction that justice, however bruised, can heal and endure. In the following weeks, the resonance of Diana's ordeal could be felt not only within the courthouse, but throughout every corner of the sprawling city. People who had never before set foot inside a legal institution now clung to the story, recounted in headlines, community Zoom calls, church basements, and even whispered over fences between neighbors. Diana Washington's resilience became a catalyst, compelling not just officials, but everyday citizens to examine the prejudices they might harbor, passively or inadvertently supporting systems that permitted such abuses. The police department faced unprecedented scrutiny, not simply for the actions of Thompson and his direct colleagues, but for all those who had watched in silence, or laughed, or turned away. Internal affairs interrogations stretched late into the night. Once untouchable supervisors were now grilled by both city council members and outraged citizens, forced to account for every complaint ignored or buried, every infraction swept under bureaucracy's heavy rug. New faces appeared at city commission meetings, mothers whose sons had been wrongfully stopped, retired veterans denied respect due to the color of their skin, ambitious teenagers eager to inherit a city cleansed by candor rather than corroded by shame. Diana received a formal apology from the police chief, broadcast citywide, though it was met by the public with a mixture of relief and hard skepticism. Words, after all, could not rewrite the violence already inscribed in memory. Institutions trembled, but so did individuals, especially those who, for years, had performed their small roles in sustaining discrimination without ever pausing to reflect. Clerks who had joked quietly about problematic visitors stopped themselves short. Lawyers who'd brushed aside complaints now pored over past cases with a fresh, haunted conscience. Even the stern janitor who'd averted his eyes the morning Diana had been assaulted now made it his mission to greet each visitor with open kindness, as if individually reclaiming a share of the building's battered honor. Yet the true transformation unfolded more slowly in the recalibration of daily rituals. Diana walked the halls, now met with respectful silence or gentle nods. New security officers underwent mandatory training not only in de-escalation, but in cultural humility and unconscious bias. Schoolchildren, led by passionate teachers, studied her case in civics class, debating what justice for all must truly look like when put to the test of flawed humanity. The city had been forced to stare unflinchingly at its own reflection, and while the healing was just beginning, no one could doubt that change was in the air. It was a change born not of law alone, but of pain's transformative reckoning, etched forever in the lives Diana had touched and the countless futures now opened by her unyielding courage. Diana's return to the bench was not easy or immediate. Each step toward her courtroom pulsed with memory, the echo of Thompson's threat, the thud of her briefcase on cold marble, the specter of a world that would still, in its darkest corners, prefer not to see her rise. But as she resumed her seat, the gavel in her hand felt heavier, not with burden, but with possibility. Her docket was flooded with new cases, and Diana presided with a patience sharpened by suffering, but also by clarity. She listened with new empathy to every defendant who claimed mistreatment, every nervous witness, wary of uniforms. In chambers, she placed a framed copy of the city's apology letter behind her desk, not as a trophy, but as a cautionary flame, a reminder to herself and to all who entered that justice demands vigilance, humility, and courage every single day. The cases she handled began to shift. More allegations of police overreach now found their way to her court. Diana became known for her careful scrutiny, demanding body camera footage, pressing officers to account for every procedural step, giving space for community defenders to present their side. Her reputation grew, not as uncompromisingly tough, but unmistakably fair and unafraid. Not all welcome this era of transparency. Some officers grumbled in back hallways, whispering about betrayal. A few old guard attorneys warned loudly that Diana was setting new precedents, that her skepticism of law enforcement overstepped tradition. But more and more, her colleagues began to see the value in her rigor, the necessity of a system that protected not only the innocent, but the public faith itself. For Diana, the hardest work was internal. She wrestled nightly with flashes of the assault, sometimes triggered by the scrape of shoes on tile or the hush of radios in court. Her therapist, a gentle, gray-haired woman, guided her through the complex ballet of trauma's slow release. "You are not just a survivor, Diana," she said once during a rainy Sunday session. "You are a builder, too. Take your time with the new foundations." At home, Diana's family kept her grounded. Her wife, a school principal, became her anchor. Evenings were spent not on legal briefs, but on stories for their young son, teaching him that bravery is equal parts endurance and honesty. For all her public heroism, it was these moments, quiet, sometimes silly, drenched in the ordinariness of love, that gave Diana the most hope for tomorrow. Anniversaries are peculiar things, landmarks carrying both the weight of past pain and the promise of remembered triumph. 1 year after the attack, the courthouse steps were filled not with protest, but with celebration. Hundreds gathered in brilliant sunlight, clutching candles and handmade banners. Choirs sang, local activists spoke, and Diana sat in the front row as honored guest. A mural, commissioned by a coalition of artists and students, was unveiled on the wall nearest the place where Diana had been assaulted. Its colors exploded outward from a striking portrait of her, deep brown skin luminous against the painted stone. Around her, images of justice, scales balanced equally, hands joined in solidarity, and above all, the courthouse doors flung wide open. Speakers retold her story, not as the tale of a single brave judge, but as the collective awakening of their city. Survivors who'd once lived in secret now stepped forward, sharing their experiences of bias in the legal system. Some heartbreaking, others tinged with humor and the defiance that comes from forging one's own path. Children played on the steps, giggling where once had echoed only cries and scorn. When Diana rose to speak, the applause was thunderous. "A year ago, I was forced to question whether there was still a place for someone like me in the halls of justice," she said, her voice steady, eyes shining. "But today, standing before you, I know our city's heart is bigger than any one moment of hate. We are not defined by our worst failures, but by what we do next. The listening, the learning, and the relentless pursuit of something better. The crowd erupted, not just in joy, but in relief. There was hope, at long last, that the old wounds could begin to mend. The city moving forward together, shaped now by a story that belonged to them all. Diana's relationships had transformed just as much as her public reputation. Her friendships grew deeper. Some people, initially hesitant to reach out after her ordeal, became steadfast supporters. Fellow judges who had once been wary of her outspokenness now saw her as a trusted mentor. Younger attorneys and interns flocked to her, determined to make the most of the roadmap her story had drawn. Diana was invited to speak at universities, police academies, and national conferences, advocating for reforms that reached far beyond her own case. Body cameras not just as tools for accountability, but as instruments of trust. Recruitment reforms focused on empathy and cultural competence, rigorous training against implicit bias. She managed all this with humility. "I am not perfect," she reminded eager listeners. "I fell apart before I found my foundation again." We must create systems where falling down isn't fatal, where recovery is always possible. At home, too, there was change. Her marriage grew both stronger and gentler. She and her wife supported each other through sleepless nights and public scrutiny. Their son, now a little older, learned to ask hard questions. Diana answered with a candor few children ever receive. She wanted him to know that real heroes are scared sometimes, but choose to stand anyway. Her closest circle, longtime friends, trusted allies, held her through the moments of despair and celebration. They toasted her victories, comforted her setbacks, and most importantly, never let her stand alone. Out of her suffering came new understanding. Our true power lies in the bonds we forge, the love we nurture, the justice we build together. As seasons turned and the headlines faded, Diana's story became less about a single calamity and more about a movement quietly reshaping the soul of her city. Young women, especially, found in her a beacon, a reminder that the doors of power are for those brave enough to shoulder history and change its course. The courthouse remained an emblem of both pain endured and progress won. With each case presided over, Diana made it clear: everyone without exception was entitled to dignity. Every voice deserved fair hearing. She launched a mentorship program for aspiring lawyers from underrepresented backgrounds, ensuring the bench would eventually reflect the dazzling spectrum of the city's true makeup. She knew setbacks would come. No victory ever completed the work of justice. Still, every email from a grateful defendant, every letter from a law student spurred to action, told her the seed had taken root. Diana's laughter, slow to return at first, now rang out freely during after-hours dinners with friends, at city events, in her living room surrounded by family. And so, with scarred strength and enduring grace, Diana Washington continued her walk up those sunlit courthouse steps. To every observer, her stride was a living promise. Though injustice may linger, Those who dare to confront it can shift the tides, not just for themselves, but for generations who will someday call those halls their own. The legacy Diana built now extended far beyond the courthouse walls. In the years following her trial by ordeal, she found herself increasingly in demand, not only as judge, but as an advisor, educator, and reform advocate on a national scale. States struggling with their own reckonings reached out, inviting her to help craft new standards for judicial conduct, police training, and civilian oversight. Diana approached each invitation with humility, but also a visionary's resolve. The changes must endure, and systems must be built to outlast individual courage. She co-authored a policy manual with other frontline legal minds, a blueprint for identifying, reporting, and rectifying civil rights violations. Her voice lent weight to federal hearings, and her testimony was cited in state house debates from coast to coast. Gradually, other stories of transformation began to emerge. Judges in southern towns refusing to hear cases unless due process was followed to the letter. Police chiefs implementing reforms and defying pressure from reactionary unions. Community organizations building their own networks of mutual aid and accountability. Back home, Diana spearheaded an annual Justice for All symposium, gathering a mosaic of voices, activists, law enforcement, victims of injustice, legislators, and most crucially, young people. There she spoke not only as a judge, but as a survivor, offering hard-won wisdom to the next generation. Justice isn't a destination. It's a living conversation, a commitment to questioning, listening, and learning together, again and again. The symposium became a point of civic pride. Murals appeared in neighborhoods from the wealthiest to the most marginalized, bearing Diana's likeness, but always alongside others. A diverse gallery that declared the future of justice would be made by many hands, each fighting not for dominance, but for dignity shared. Diana's experience entered the city's curriculum, taught not as dry legal precedent, but as a living, breathing case study in bias, resistance, and reconciliation. Teachers welcomed her into classrooms, and she found herself fielding questions from students more direct and incisive than any cross-examination. "Did you ever want to quit?" a fifth grader once asked, his eyes wide with real concern. Diana did not deflect or gloss over the pain. "Yes, every day for a while," she replied solemnly. But the pain meant something important needed to change, not just for me, but for everyone who sees themselves in my story. These sessions bore fruit. High schoolers organized courtroom equality mock trials and petitioned for their own student-run ombudsman committees. Some of Diana's fiercest critics came to seek her advice, confessing their misjudgments and asking forgiveness. Young men and women who had grown up mistrusting the justice system began to sign up for internships and paralegal work. The university's pre-law program grew dramatically, its demographics quickly shifting to reflect the city's true mosaic. Diana mentored dozens of new arrivals, often reminding them, "You're not here simply to memorize law books. You're here to make justice real." The seeds planted during her darkest season flourished, ripening into a movement for renewal that could not be turned back. For all the public change, the hardest healing remained within Diana herself. Even with the accolades, invitations, and triumphs, unexpected reminders would sometimes ambush her. An aggressive voice in a parking lot, a suspicious glance from an officer on a downtown beat. These moments would cause her breath to catch, her muscles to brace. Over time, though, her coping strengthened. Through therapy, meditation, and the unconditional support of her family, Diana learned to let those moments pass through her rather than live inside her. Lessons bloom. She and her wife began each day with small rituals: quiet coffee, morning walks, laughter with their son bustling off to school, painting and music on weekends. These became daily reminders that the future held more joy than grief if one kept moving toward the light. She shared this journey with others, leading healing circles for those who'd experienced discrimination, especially women and people of color in law. Rather than pretending to be invulnerable, she modeled what it meant to grieve and recover in community. These circles, held both in person and online, brought together voices once isolated by shame or fear. Together, they transformed pain into solidarity, into action. The lesson spread: true justice must always make room for restoration, for healing that lifts not only the aggrieved, but the system as a whole. Diana watched as lives once riven by doubt began to mend, slowly, imperfectly, but with dogged hope. Understanding that her time on the bench would not last forever, Diana set her sights on legacy building. She launched a nonprofit foundation aimed at supporting legal education and advocacy for underrepresented youth. Each summer, dozens of teenagers interned in her chambers and with local law firms, learning the intricacies of law, ethics, and the imperative of conscience. The Foundation's annual gala became a gleaming celebration of progress. The city's most prominent attorneys, business people, and educators mingled with young people who only a few years prior might never have believed the law belonged to them. Scholarships were awarded, campaigns for law enforcement reform funded, and dreams of social entrepreneurship seeded. Diana found joy in these gatherings, sometimes slipping into the background to simply observe. Her legacy incarnate in friendships formed, possibilities unlocked, injustices confronted not by her hand alone, but by a growing, interconnected community. She realized that true reform, like true justice, is a relay. Each generation must take the baton and race forward, undaunted by the imperfect handoff from the generation before. To honor the past while propelling the future, Diana instituted a citywide day of service in memory of those harmed by injustice, inviting all, from police officers to high school freshmen, to participate. The simple act of working side by side broke barriers more effectively than any speech. As years accumulated, Diana Washington's ordeal was no longer spoken of as singular tragedy, but as the event that catalyzed a city's renewal. Each spring, the courthouse hosts an open house, its marble steps thronged with citizens, officials, and schoolchildren. laughter mixing with song where once suspicion reigned. Diana, though older and perhaps a step slower, still walks those steps every year during the city's Justice Day. She is often joined by her former adversaries, several reformed officers, even Thompson's supervisor, now a passionate advocate for accountability, and by the countless young people she mentored. They speak with gratitude, not only to Diana, but to each other. The circle of justice, once broken, is now reforged. In her final public address before retirement, Diana's words resonate across the assembly. Justice is not a gift bestowed by the powerful. It is a promise we make to one another, renewed each day by our choices, our courage, and our love. May none of us forget which side of that promise we must live on. As the sun sets, its golden light streaming across the courthouse facade, the city stands renewed. Not perfect, but committed. Diana steps down for the last time, content in her heart that tomorrow's battles for dignity and inclusion will be carried boldly forward, not in her own name, but in the spirit that justice, once awakened, can never sleep again.